I've asked a few people at random what they know about the name Betsi Cadwaladr. A typical response has been, oh yes, she was the Welsh Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale is, of course, very famous for her achievements in revolutionising medical care during the Crimean War, and she's also credited with establishing the basis of modern nursing. Betsi Cadwaladr's name, though, was long forgotten, but has become more prominent in recent times. But can she justifiably be called the Welsh Florence Nightingale? I have to say that some of her story came as a surprise to me, and as a result, I am making a video which is a little bit different to that which I had anticipated. Most of what we know about Betsi comes from what she tells us about herself in her autobiography. Betsi Davis, a balaclava nurse, an autobiography of Elizabeth Davis. Yes, Elizabeth Davis. Elizabeth, Betsi to her family and those who knew her, had apparently decided to adopt the surname Davis when living in England. She thought that Cadwaladr was a bit awkward for the English to pronounce. The book was published in 1857 and has been reprinted twice more recently. From what I've read about Betsi, much of her life before Crimea is largely skipped over, covered in just a few sentences or paragraphs. I want to take a look at it, though, because having read the book, I think it raises an important question, which is, can we believe everything that Betsi tells us about herself? The book is called an autobiography, but in reality it isn't. It's an oral history. Betsi had kept no diaries or many letters to refer to, and so she told her story as best as she could remember it to the respected author Jane Williams. In the introduction, Jane showers Betsi with compliments and admiration for her character. It seems, though, that Jane Williams had a tough job in organising the information she obtained. After all, Betsi was getting on a bit then and in very poor health, and Jane Williams tells us that what she was told was given in a desultory and digressive manner. She knew that lapse of time and intermediate events had cast their shadows over some scenes. Discrepancies and mistakes may be detected in the details, but the writer believes that the narrative as a whole bears internal evidence to the light of its truth. It's a clear warning that the accuracy of what we read cannot be completely guaranteed. But on the other hand, it's a reassurance that it is all essentially true. But is it? The book is written in the first person, but the words are not Betsi's. They are mainly those of Jane Williams. As a first language Welsh speaker, Betsi may have been happy enough for someone else to do the writing in English. But her words are included when, as Jane Williams says, they are apt and striking. Elizabeth, later Betsi, was born in 1789, one of the many children of tenant farmer and preacher David Cadwaladr and his wife Judith. They lived in the tiny village of Llanetyll, which is alongside Llyn Tegid, Bala Lake, in North Wales. It was a Welsh-speaking and, of course, religious family, and religion was important to Betsi throughout her life. She was never without her Bible. She describes episodes from her childhood. She said she was athletic and full of tricks, so much so that a gentleman once gave me a £5 note for my activity, and my father bought a cow with the money, and also that she had long, thick and curly black hair. People used often to give me sixpence for letting it fall down for them to look at. Betsy's first job was as a maid to a local family, but she didn't like it and ran away to Liverpool. Then, employed by a well-off couple, she says that she travelled Europe. She worked for a Sir George something or other and his wife. She doesn't give a surname. Betsi frequently omits surnames on names of places. Instead, she just gives us the first letter. She tells us that when in what is now Belgium, she witnessed the aftermath of that great battle of Waterloo and saw the battlefield 5 days later. It was, she said, thickly strewn with dead bodies and with people searching for injured friends. She states in the book that she had very many offers of marriage, and there are indeed very many, so many that it's difficult to keep track of them, including one from an Indian prince and another from a very persistent Portuguese businessman who followed her across oceans. All were rejected except for one. Betsi relates that she became engaged to a ship's captain, one Thomas Harris of the ship Perseverance. She says he bought a house and furnished it ready for their future married life. But the marriage was not to be. When in a Liverpool shop buying groceries, she said she saw a newspaper, and in it a report of a maritime disaster. It was about Captain Harris's ship, the Perseverance. It had sunk, and he was drowned along with all hands. All, that is, except for a young boy who had clung to a rock. Betsi fainted in shock, she tells us, and was carried home. However, there seems to be a problem with this story, a very big one, and I will come back to that shortly. The next phase of Betsi's life saw her become a maid working on 2 merchant ships, first the Iris and then the Denmark Hill. She travelled to the Caribbean and later Australia. She spent a few months working on the island of Trinidad as a maid and looking after children. She also said she visited what is now Guyana and visited a plantation with more than 1,000 slaves. Rather strangely, Betsi mentioned some positives of the life of slaves. She claimed that they worked a fairly short week and had weekends free. She said, "I did not think their state was slavery at all." But as we now know, the reality was of course very different. So could she really have visited a slave plantation? One remarkably diligent researcher, as part of an academic analysis of Betsi's book as an historical source, went to the great trouble of researching the journeys made by the Iris and the Denmark Hill when Betsi had been on board. The researcher found that Betsi's ships did indeed travel to the Caribbean and also to Australia, but Betsi adds much more information about other places that she visited: Singapore, India, China, various places in South America. There's a lot of them. But all this is, according to the researcher, contradicted by the meticulous records which exist to this day in the maritime journal Lloyd's List. It has information dating back to the 1700s about ships' journeys, cargoes, and where and when they loaded and unloaded. He says that there is no evidence that Betsi's ships went to many of the places she mentions, so she couldn't have visited them. And that brings me back to the story about the drowned fiancé, Captain Harris. The researcher found that there was a Captain Harris, there was a ship, the Perseverance, and it did sink. But the maritime records show, as do newspapers of the time, that every crew member, including Captain Harris, was saved. So Betsy's story is not true. And we hear no more of Captain Harris in the rest of the book. Readers of the book may raise an eyebrow or two at quite a few of Betsy's experiences. Here are a few. She borrowed an army officer's uniform in France, put on false whiskers, went to a celebration of the return of the French monarchy, and, she says, flirted with the ladies. In the Caribbean, she saw a 6-winged, 12-footed creature that was hunted and had to be killed with cannon fire. She also saw a unicorn in South Africa. She tells us that she bonded with the child of the Emperor and Empress of Brazil and attended their chapel, where she accidentally opened a secret trapdoor. In a violent storm, sailors couldn't cope with the sails, but she was strong enough to release them to prevent the ship sinking, with the captain telling her, "God bless you, Betsy, you saved my old ship." She visited the harem of the Emperor of China, where she conversed in Welsh and was understood, and then accidentally interrupted a meeting of the Emperor himself. In Calcutta she met a Mrs. Nelson, who she then met again years later in North Wales, and only then realised that it was her older sister, Mary. Well, the reader must decide how to consider all this. After giving up her life at sea, she used her saved-up pay as a maid, she said, to buy houses in London. 60. Yes, 60. But this was a fraud, and the culprit fled abroad. Then Betsy was left houses and a country estate and several farms in the will of someone she had nursed. But the will was legally flawed, and she lost the lot again. There's a lot more like this in the book, and perhaps I'm making heavy weather of it, but I think it does raise an important question. In view of the fact that most of what we know about Betsy is what Betsy tells us about herself in the book, do we believe it all, including about Crimea? Fortunately, though, for this important episode of Betsy's life, we have quite a bit of information from other people. Living in London, Betsy got a job as a nurse in Guy's Hospital. A nurse today is, of course, a skilled professional. In the mid-1800s, a nurse was used more generally for those looking after the sick in any capacity. It isn't clear from the book whether Betsy had any formal training, but she certainly had practical hospital experience for about a year. In late 1853, the Crimean War erupted. A young Irishman called William Howard Russell dispatched reports from Crimea to the Times newspaper. They revealed to a shocked public the horrors of that conflict and the appalling neglect of sick and injured troops. Betsy read an account of the Battle of Alma, probably written by this famous pioneering war reporter. It motivated her to want to do something to ease the suffering. Hospitals during the early stages of this conflict were just buildings overrun with rats, insects, disease, and had the most basic of treatments, if any at all. It was calculated at the time that for every soldier killed in battle, a further 7 died of diseases. Betsy was too late to join the first group of nurses who went with Florence Nightingale, and so she joined a second group. Bear in mind that at this time she was all of 65 years old. And they were warned by the Secretary for War before they went, you go either to make yourselves or ruin yourselves. She travelled in a group of more than 50 nurses to the south of France, and from there boarded a French troopship. They arrived at Scutari in Turkey, where many soldiers lay injured and sick. Frustratingly, the new arrivals were not allowed to begin nursing, and instead given menial tasks to pass the time. At Scutari, Betsi met Florence Nightingale, the superintendent of nursing. Betsi had earlier, and rather oddly, decided in advance that she wasn't going to like her. She said in the book, "I did not like the name Nightingale. When I first hear a name, I am very apt to know by my feeling whether I shall like the person who bears it." Frustrated by inaction, Betsi told her that she would return home if not allowed to go onwards to the Crimea to nurse the troops near the conflict. Florence Nightingale allegedly replied, "If you do go to the Crimea, you go against my will." "This put up my Welsh blood," recalled Betsi. "Do you think I'm a dog or animal to make me over? I have a will of my own," she told her. The two women were very different. Betsi was proudly Welsh, working class, evidently straight-talking, and a practical kind of person. Florence Nightingale was an Englishwoman of a higher social class and someone committed to systems and organization. Anyway, whatever was said, Betsi got on a ship to Balaclava. Upon arrival, she said, "I shall never forget the sights I saw as long as I live." The first soldier she attended to had frostbite. His toes fell off when the bandage was removed from his feet. Another frostbitten man's hand just fell off. Uncleaned wounds were packed with maggots. The suffering was terrible, and the challenge was enormous. The sick and injured had no beds, blankets, or pillows. They lay on boards in filth under their greatcoats. Betsi supervised a few assistants and set to work. She requested 300 or 400 beds from stores, which she said in the book arrived the following day. Betsi and her very few orderlies worked night and day to do what they could in desperate circumstances. She worked like this for about 6 weeks. But as a major problem was a lack of food, she was put in charge of the extra diet kitchen. It was her responsibility to obtain the stores to cook and provide adequate nutrition for the patients. She seems to have been very good at it, pragmatic and determined to cajole her way into getting supplies out of a chaotic system. Being in charge of that kitchen was a responsible and challenging job, particularly challenging for someone of Betsi's age. She did her very best in the face of bureaucracy and chaotic organization. Betsi worked very long days delivering food and drink to the patients, who, she said, called her mother. The book has several recollections of her dealings with Florence Nightingale. Some of them seem to have been about Betsi telling her off. For example, Betsi thought Florence lofty and having no authority over her. When she called into her kitchen, Betsi says she told her, "I should have soon have expected to see the Queen as you." Florence Nightingale did approve of Betsi's hard work, though. A witness records Betsi as being very pleased indeed by the positive comments she received from the lady with the lamp. Fever such as dysentery and cholera raged throughout Balaclava, and, eventually, Betsi succumbed to illness. Worn out and unwell, she decided to return to London to recuperate. Back in Britain, public interest in the Crimean War and the work of Florence Nightingale was great. A book by another nurse, the Jamaican-born Mary Seacole, had been a commercial success. Writer Jane Williams must have thought that Betsi's story also deserved an audience. The pair sat and talked. Jane Williams pieced together random recollections to craft the book, which found a publisher. And so Can she justifiably be called the Welsh Florence Nightingale? It is, I suppose, a convenient term to speak of two women caring for troops during the same war. But let's remember that Florence Nightingale was a hugely influential person, key to structural changes in nursing that became common in Britain and other countries. She used her skill as a statistician to communicate to the public and politicians by using graphs instead of masses of text. And it worked. She shamed the government to act and improve hygiene and treatment for soldiers in Crimea, and later improved public health at home. And she made nursing a skilled profession, hence her enduring fame. But full credit to Betsi, she did her best in a disastrous situation. She flourished in charge of that extra diet kitchen, and her efforts were much appreciated, as we can see from the words of others. Betsi's boss, nursing superintendent Margaret Weir, wrote to her on departure, "Your going away is a serious loss to me. I cannot hope to find anyone who will do all that you have done for so long, so untiring, for never for one single day did you desert your post, up early and late and ever preparing comforts for between 200 and 300 sick." David Fitzgerald, purveyor to the forces, wrote this recommendation: "I have much pleasure in recording my opinion of the extreme merits of Mrs. Davis, in charge of the extra kitchen of the hospital. She was extensively trusted. I cannot speak too highly of her." And the principal medical officer at Balaclava wrote, "I cannot speak in too high terms of Mrs. Davis's universal good conduct and her unremitting attention to the sick." Much later, Florence Nightingale wrote a somewhat positive but much less effusive comment about Betsi. She thought her kind-hearted and hard-working, but with a foul tongue and a cross temper. She wrote, "She did a great deal of good service in cooking for the hospital, and I would gladly have kept her, notwithstanding her mischief-making by those in authority." Florence Nightingale hated the book, which she wrote has a greater amount of lies than I could have conceived possible. The book was written evidently not just to tell a story, but also to raise some money for Betsi, who at this time was living in poverty with her sister in London. The original book contained a request for donations. Perhaps Betsi's scarcely believable adventures that she tells us about during her time at sea, they are an attempt to make the more mundane years before Crimea a bit more interesting. But the book was not a success, receiving some highly critical reviews. It sold just a few hundred copies and presumably made little or no money for Betsi. Betsi died in 1860 at the age of 72. She never did marry. She was buried in Abney Park Cemetery in London. Her original pauper's grave now has a headstone provided by the Royal College of Nursing in Wales. The college has also adopted her as a nurse heroine. Her name lives on in several published accounts, and the Health Authority adopted her name in 2009. Overall, Betsi's autobiography reads like a strange mixture of factual experiences and wild fantasies. Yes, she definitely worked alongside Florence Nightingale, but did she really have those conversations with her repeated word for word in the book? Well, who knows? Of one thing there is no doubt. Betsi Cadwaladr bravely did her bit during that war in Crimea. She made life a bit better for many sick and wounded soldiers, and her name lives on today as a memorial to the great work that she did.